lectures and PowerPoints in our program this year. So I feel a bit of a hypocrite starting with PowerPoint and lectures. So I want everyone in the audience and whoever's remotely to also know that at any point, this is going to work much better as a conversation if we can, an interactive session. I have way more potential slides or things to talk about than there is time. And it would be really good that I could cater sort of our discussion and talk to the kinds of things you're interested in. Because I've heard this stuff before, it's kind of not as interesting to me. So, it would be really good if you can, at any point, just say, hey, stop there, let's talk about that, or what about this, or you're way off base, I don't believe you, that's a complete sham. I'm open to any of those comments. Probably the last one best. So that can start conversation. So I want to start not with this stuff, but actually talk about two aha moments that I personally have had. It's about me since I'm talking here, and I have the liberty of this in the first 5 minutes. Over the last year, because I'll be frank, we were talking a little bit earlier. I generally start these talks these days with an apology because I am just a PhD. I'm not an MD. Faculty of Medicine, you sort of bow your head down and say, I'm just a PhD. And at first, I thought it was just me that started feeling that way. Yesterday, I had a brilliant researcher, geneticist, and we were chatting. And during the time, at two different points in our conversation, she apologized for just being a PhD. And it was pretty incredible. When we started this, about 3 years plus, this was a former dean's vision. This has been brewing in this ecosystem, as far as I can tell, since the early 70s. There have been multiple retreats, discussions, definitely committee meetings. I'm sure there were lots of committee meetings. But this kind of didn't get off the ground for a while, and I think there are a lot of reasons for it. Partly, we as a group around here are actually really solid at research. We have a lot of research potential, even though we have a fairly small pool of money that seems to be shrinking and going away. But we have a lot of really talented people, really focused people. But for some reason, a lot of that research doesn't translate or doesn't move along as well as in other ecosystems. Let's just put it that way. I think that's a safe thing. And so people have been thinking, what do we do? How do we do this? How do we start thinking about training or thinking about improving the collaboration, essentially, the networks here, the incentives, honestly, culture of being able to think beyond just, hey, wait a minute, I have to publish. That's it. And otherwise I won't have my next grad student, and then I'm off the tenure track, or I'm off promotion. Because we're kind of here to help people. And almost everyone I talk to, that, originally that's what we got into some of these things, some of our lives and careers for, because it was this altruistic goal. One of the students in the program, so you should know the program is weird. I'll be the first to admit it. We have one student this year when we started that was 22. She actually celebrated her birthday this year. And then another student at the opposite, sort of higher range, I won't say highest, but it's 47, also celebrated a birthday. And everyone is in between. We have people, the minority were recent graduates, clinicians, professional research coordinators. Of the 17 in the first cohort, 6 are faculty at the various hospitals around. 2 are directors, one of innovation and e-learning. The other I found out is a director of wellness, which I have no idea about. We have people that are well published. We have people that are unpublished. and they're all in a room together. And they have different interests and different ideas. And at one point this year, one of the students that actually works here came up to me and said, I was never taught any of this. I had no idea. I had no idea. And I don't know even where to start, but I have 10 different ideas already of what to do to improve my lab and my work. And then he proceeded to solve what apparently, essentially, was a mini battle, War of the Roses, in his lab area where he and his tissue bank or their lab were not sharing tissues. Because of some historic fight between personalities, but as of December 18th of this past year, being down the hall from each other, they buried the hatchet and they started sharing tissues again. It wasn't a class assignment, it wasn't an intentional thing. He just, because he was surrounded by the ideas and talk, felt that he needed to do something. And for me, as an educator, as a teacher, the idea that somebody who is well into their career, I mean, he has a PhD, an MD, multiple degrees, could start thinking within 4 months slightly differently than what he was used to was amazing. Another one of the students that came up to me in around January, February of this past semester or term said to me, you know, when I came in here, I had a clear idea of what I was going to do. I'm a researcher. I have research. I actually have grants already, so I was just going to, you know, skip by and do what I'm already doing and get a master's degree. And I keep stressing the piece of paper is meaningless ultimately. It doesn't really help you at the end. I mean, it could in some minds, but we failed if that's all you get out of this program. You've wasted your time. And he said to me, you know, I've come to realize that this research is I'm going to do anyway. Here I have an opportunity to work with other people and think outside of what I normally do to do something bigger. And again, it's just like my heart goes, wow. So I have a clicker. And I have slides. So around 2008, there was a publication in Nature that basically said, hey, there's this gap. And then all of a sudden, it became popular, this word translation. I'm going to talk a little bit about this, and I realize that I'm going to have to go through this pretty quick, but as of 2008, increasingly there's all this body of literature starting to be produced talking about translation. What is translation? Apparently we all do it, or at least everybody claims to be doing some portion of it. In the CIHR, there's a little space. How are you going to translate your, mobilize your knowledge? So, PowerPoint usually comes up, or conferences, and so everybody's doing it. But when you tease out and start talking to people, everyone is talking about different things that they're actually doing. And one of I'm not going to say who, but I had an experience with a very senior person in the hospital system here, and he said, sometimes when I hear you talk, it's like you guys invented translation. No, I will make no such claim. I will honestly say that I think translation was invented the first time a human being saw a rock and a stick and said, hey, I can apply this knowledge somehow. And then we had our first axe. But translation is a very, very, in semiotic terms, discourse community-based term. It's something that is around health sciences. It's something that is very prevalent here, but the second you go to engineering or computer science, now we're talking applied science, we're talking about engineering, we're talking about other words, transformation. I had a big argument that it shouldn't be called translation, transformation. Like, okay, go ahead, change it. Be my guest. But the idea is basically, it has to do with research. In some ways, there's a lot of resistance in the people. I've been talking to a lot of people over the last 3 years. The first place we have to start with is what's research? couple of days back, we were talking to a number of researchers, and I had research in one of my slides. I said, that's not research. That's not research. That implies wet lab at the bench. You are not talking about research. You're talking to people. That's ethnography or something. That's not research. So other people would beg to differ. Talking to people in some disciplines is actual research. But I want to specify what it is I'm talking about a little bit, and it's going to be very vague, and I'm sure somebody will object to it. But when I'm talking about research, I'm just talking about generation of new knowledge in some way, shape, or form. And that could be knowledge based on discovery that happens in the lab, but that can also be knowledge in learning how to apply something differently, that rock, and figuring out the best rock to use. So I want to start there so that we're all on sort of the same page of research. Then what is translation? So when I came into the program about 3 years ago, and my first meeting was at the provost office, and they were all talking about this program that was going to happen, but they only had a paragraph about it. The one thing they were certain of was the name, Translational Research, period. And at the time I thought, okay, well, what does this mean? So I spent about 6 months learning about what this thing is. And I realized very quickly that it really depends who you talk to. So if you go to Europe, you're more likely to hear translational medicine, not exclusively. If you go to the States now, with Obama's funding of it, translational science. I had the pleasure to talk to Chris Austin, who runs NCATS. He at the time had a budget of $665 million, 150 of which was devoted to education. I'm just salivating. Oh, wow, amazing. And it's like, oh, we're not getting good returns on this. we don't have that many zeros. So people started talking about this continuum since 2008. I'm just going to skip through this. But it could mean all of these little things like bench to bedside, and that's where we stop. It could mean from animal to human, or from theory to a cell. It could mean cell to society. Everyone has a different conceptualization. So I'm going to quickly skip through a lot of these. These can be, you can look through, these are different models that people have been having, and essentially give you sort of a very general, this is actually from NIH. It happened to appear after we met with Chris for our discussions over some drinks. But it's a really close definition to the one we were using at the time. And it's really about observations, processes of turning knowledge, or what's generated, discovery or otherwise, from different contexts. So it can be community as well as clinic, as well as lab. And it's all about improving health. That was a big thing that we had lots of fights about. We can get into it some other time. But it's the tangible. It's doing something. It's tangible benefits to people, and that's sort of key. There's some definitions about various approaches to this, and different slants on it. But at the core, it's all about how do we make what we discover usable? How do we change health, people's health, with it? And so that's sort of the definition I'm going to work with, despite all of these various diagrams that people have decided. So this comes from the Harvard Catalyst. The Catalyst is one of 43 programs that NCAT sponsors. The National Centers for the Advancement of Clinical and Translational Science, which then has these 43 centers work on these different areas. And they essentially give money to junior faculty and postdocs to do more of what they've already been doing, and then they call that translating and promoting translation. Normally, we have this academic path. I won't go into that, but it rarely talks about the patient. Increasingly, since 2008, there's more discussion, so some of this is starting to change. Doesn't matter, any influence on the universe whatsoever. So, but whereas academics, I mean, this is what I was taught going through. I realized about partway through my PhD that it had nothing to do with actually generating anything new or doing anything special or being innovative in any way. It was all about learning how to get along with my supervisor and make sure that he and his friends and others during my defense committee would say yes. I mean, that was the bottom line. If you really think about it, that's the bottom line of the PhD, at least in my experience. So, you know, we're talking about this valley of death, that there's all this stuff that happens, but it doesn't get translated. And so since 2008, we've started having these papers talking about T1, T2, T3, and it seems over time, as you'll see, the T's increase in number. And the approaches and the difficulties keep increasing in number. Sorry, I'll go back to that. That's actually kind of... So if you look at this, the T's and the systems, and how are we going to look at this? It get more colorful, and there's a 0 then, and there's a 4, and preclinical. And everyone has this idea of how this all works. So everyone's talking about a lot of these things, but a lot of them, you know, are very much the same, but always subtly different. So when we talk about it in the program, what we've sort of come up with is just an overall landscape, and I'm trying to be very sort of open. It's this huge collection of stuff. And the bottom line is that because it's a huge collection of stuff, no one person can do all of this stuff. No one person can be the amazing super uber translator, although maybe Uber could come up with that. But it usually depends on teams and people working together at various levels. And so one of the hardest things, it seems, about translation is communication between people and how they work and what they do. And, you know, in MedSci, at least, I've come to find those are called soft skills, when really they're core skills. These are the things that if we all know how to do very well, then the other stuff we know how to do can be done better. But that's a hard sell to say we're going to charge X number for a graduate program so you can learn to network. Although I would argue that Rotman does that. Exactly that. So, and very well. So beyond the debates and discussions, for many years, do we do translational research? Are we actually hands-on trying to translate it? Or does translational mean we think about the processes of translating research? And really, you can't do both apparently at the same time. You can't do something and reflect on it. Or at least that's how it's told. The program has to be one thing or the other. You can only have really high-end people, PIs in it, and then you get them to sit around the table and think about what they're doing in a very abstract sense, and then you have a great program. Or you have people that don't know what they're doing, and you get them to do it, and then they don't really have to understand it as long as they can talk to the PIs and be helpful. Other people have been talking about this and have basically said, well, this is a good thing that we have this valley of death. You know, it's great, it's absolutely phenomenal because, and this came actually from a VC I had a chat with, because I don't want to see the garbage. I don't want to see the stuff. I want that to remain at the other end. I only want to see the good nuggets eventually. And you know, at the time I was kind of thinking to myself, that's fabulous, but that assumes that all the good nuggets make it to you and they don't remain for decades, let's say PCR, you know, on a shelf somewhere because nobody knows what to do with it. That assumes that all the good things don't fail. And, you know, maybe that's not the best system. And maybe some things don't get to the bench side simply because people don't know how to do it. Or it's the wrong alignment of the stars, the wrong financing. Oh, maybe the institution has wrong funding mechanisms or disincentives. You know, so there has to be a better way. And over the last little while, in terms of thinking about it, there are huge challenges if you think about, if you have and know something and this is a wow moment for you and this is amazing, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can get it to the next stage and, let's say, into a clinic. Or if you're in a clinic, that doesn't mean that you can get it to physicians in the community. Or even if you get it to the physicians in the community, that doesn't mean that the physicians will know what to do with it or how to tell patients. Or even if they understand and are brilliant at keeping up with the mounds of information they're inundated with on a day-to-day basis, that somehow they will be able to communicate it to their patient appropriately. That doesn't mean that that patient will know what to do with it or do it. And that doesn't mean that how those patients use those things will influence their communities. And it doesn't mean that those communities will then be able to influence their policymakers to make those changes so that the health system or the standard of practice changes. So from the aha moment, there are all of these potential things that can go wrong. And how do we improve this? How do we make it better? Well, you know, one of the hardest things is picking the right project. And I hear that all over. Well, how do we know what's going to be translated? If the path to translation or implementation or applied science or whatever it is always different because it's contextual and it's based on the discovery and it's always unique, how do we know that it's going to work? You don't. There are no guarantees. But maybe there are ways to pick things that are better than others. Maybe there are ways along the way. I mean, it's used in entrepreneurship every day these days. It seems to be resonating. Fail early, fail fast, to learn from your failures, start over, pivot, understand where you're at. Don't keep going if there's potential warning signs. So how do you pick the right things? Then how do you coordinate? If this activity, if this thinking, if this interaction is by nature interdisciplinary, and you asked me how I ended up in this role, and I will point it here. And I said that it was based on a lie couched in sort of falsehood. Well, at the time, I was the assistant director of the Knowledge Media Design Institute, and I was approached by somebody from the Institute of Medical Science, and they said, "Wow, you know, we've been discussing, had some great conversations about you on collaboration. We are really in trouble because we don't know what to do right now. We don't have anyone that wants to focus on this, but we have been mandated to create an interdisciplinary program to think about innovation. And I heard you talk about this. Come meet my director. We'll talk. This sounds really good." So I came and we talked and we started going and we started talking and became more and more engaged, and I started writing the proposals and doing the research, and I had this vision of all these people, like from drama, from music, interacting with engineers and clinicians around these problem sets where you would say, solve this, and these brilliant think tank-like people would put all of their different headsets together and through various processes come up with brilliant innovation. Then I learned, and this was unfortunately a little late, that we had a major miscommunication, because that was my view of collaboration and interdisciplinarity. At the time, and very much so in many ways still, the people I tend to work with, their view is a neuroscientist may collaborate with a neurologist or a surgeon who does brain surgery at some level, and that is the extent of interdisciplinary collaboration sometimes. You know, this is we've stepped out of our domain a little bit. And that's hard enough as it is. There are good reasons in many ways why our system starts doing that. These days, knowledge moves so fast, the production of knowledge moves so fast, it's very difficult for any one individual to know everything within one sliver of a domain, much less be able to speak across domains and with other people. Like, we have to so focus on what we're doing to stay on top of it and keep relevant that trying to do so in multiple areas is just impossible. So there are good reasons for it, but how do you make that an advantage as opposed to a barrier? So the other sort of barriers is how do you convince other people that what you're doing is worthwhile? And ironically enough, one of the things that when I really fought hard about it first was introducing a course called The Rhetoric of Science. We're not car salesmen, someone said to me. We don't need to know anything about rhetoric. And, that's just lying. And I said, well, let's step back. Let's understand. The rhetoric is really the systematic thinking around persuading people. And you use actually rhetoric in anything you do in your daily lives. When you write a grant and you focus it on a target audience in your peer review, there are ways to think about structuring your conversation to appeal to them. And there are ways to structure your tweets to appeal to your patients. And there are ways that you as an academic or a clinician or every day think about putting your words in a certain order, in a certain way. And the more you know and the more you learn about it, the better you can get at this. So with our students, the first thing we did was look at vaccine debates. And if you look at the vaccine debates, it's all conversational rhetoric and persuasion. Some of the stuff has zero facts behind it. And yet there are people that are adamant that I can't vaccinate my child, despite the science. And then at the other end, you hear in media, the scientific study says this. But when you learn it, the study had a cohort of maybe 3 to 12 people, and the correlation is so, derived by so many variations of statistics that it's really meaningless. That's rhetoric, using statistics, using ways to convince people of things. And so, interestingly enough, the students especially the clinicians and some of the PhDs who had very deep scientific training in the past felt that was one of the interesting things. They wanted more because that sort of opened some of their eyes in the way that language and the way that writing and communication is used. And that's very important when you're working with people. So where we've come to in this time is lots of people are doing translational work. This program did not invent translation. We make no such claims. But what we are battling with as sort of our students as guinea pigs is how do we do this? If translation is always or unique and contextual and different and always based on the situation or the invention or the people involved, can it even be taught? Can you actually get better at it? Maybe trial and error. Maybe a few people are predisposed. There are some absolutely amazing, excellent translators out there that couldn't teach them a thing, or maybe could, don't know. There are some people that are really bad at translation and don't know why and have no idea how to approach this. But the question that we started, and I realized retrospectively, that the assumption was, in starting a graduate program about translation, that there was some way to teach translation. So whether right or wrong at this point, sort of we're committed. And so we have to figure out how to do this because, frankly, as far as I can tell from, and I've done a fair bit of literature and I've done a fair bit of communication, and it can be done differently. It can be done by many different people in many different ways, but nobody has any one gold star sure-proof method that we will take you and make you a brilliant translator at the end of 2 years. It just, as far as I know, nobody has yet published the, hey, this is the way to do it paper. So this is very much in terms of the way we're thinking about the process, and it is evolving, and we welcome feedback and discussion, but it is an attempt to look at a systematic approach towards understanding how to move science, how to implement it.
One of the key points is that you've got to have a really, really strong champion, right? Somebody who fully understands his or her science and then has the the balcony view of where this is going and having that very strong persuasion to be able to convince the VCs to invest, convince the granting agencies to invest. And role modeling, I think, is hugely important. Isn't that right?
Yeah. So I completely agree. In some ways of doing it, sorry to make this association, the cult of the personality is very significant. There are some superstars, even in this ecosystem, like several names come to mind. One of whom was the one that I had a conversation, and it sounds like you think you invented translation. I've been doing this since before you were born. And so, yes, that's true. At levels, you need multiple people. But I think increasingly there is also the case to be made that it's not necessarily just the champions alone that can do this. And I mean, well, we can talk a little more, but I think, and my gut is telling me, is that there is increasingly a new kind of professional class developing. And this professional class, and we can get into this, is, and I'm almost scared to say this because I'm going to get such reaction, but it's a new branch or a new addition or a new thing of science that has existed, and it's not new in the new sense, but I think it's becoming recognized as formal. And it is not new in the sense that this is, wow, amazing, this is a invention. It's more of a recharacterization and different labels. So it's applied health science. It's the people that are in the middle layer that aren't necessarily going to be the ones that do the aha discovery at the bench, but understand that discovery deeply enough and understand where it could go, but they also have expertise in other areas or know other people and networks in other areas that can make those connections and then talk to the VCs or find somebody that can talk to the VCs. These are the people that can then talk to a major research project, find out what they're doing, understand it, and then see the potential. And I think it's slightly different kind of thinking methodology, just like engineering. They know math and physics, but they're not the physicists and mathematicians that make the theory necessarily. They learn how to understand it and apply it for context.
So my brother is a screenwriter in Hollywood, and he wrote a script and he sold the script. It got picked up by a network. It got developed by a team, and there was a showrunner, and that showrunner kind of runs the show. And my brother had deep regrets about the direction that show took. How do you deal with the insecurities that I'm sure everyone in this room will feel when they hand off their baby to the translator to run with?
Well, not everyone will be handing them off, and not every translation will be done or be involved the PI necessarily, or will involve things. So this is, some of this we're going to start with in terms of this process and thinking about it. Some of those problems can actually be solved at the beginning. And for example, I think we can talk about it because I think that's sort of misalignment of expectations, right? And the show met a need, which is my next point, but it wasn't necessarily your brother's need. And I think that is sort of at the heart of it. So I'm not saying that we can solve that 100% all the time. I think where the difference lies between a show and something that helps people live better is something that helps people live better. If whatever you do in some way, even if it's not entirely your own, and some people will never let go of it, and not everyone will do this. This is not for everyone. This is not going to be received or welcomed by everyone. But there will be a subset of the population that says, okay, I want to continue doing my science, or I want to continue doing my work, and I couldn't be bothered, but I know if I work with this person, or I work with these people, or I work along these ideas, then this might end up somewhere. and I might help somebody, but I can still do what I love. And I don't have to abandon my 18-year investment into my training to risk it on a venture. And I'm not just talking about ventures, that's the other real quick thing. When we talk about translation, at least in the perspective of the program, it's not commercialization, they're not synonymous. We support projects and ideas that may make zero money. Money's not a factor, it's to advance health. So policy, other interventions, whatever, it's just mobilizing knowledge for health. Commercialization is a small potential part. We don't focus, Rotman does it better, well, arguably.
Is policy reactive?
Pardon?
Is policy generation reactive or is it primary?
Question.
That's a deep question. I think it could be a little bit of both, mostly reactive as far as I think we can see it.
So how can you then do research in accord with policy? It's a circular argument.
It is, and that's why our diagram is circular. You can't, I mean, some of these things, without changes in thinking, you can't get around. To change policy, in many ways, you have to prove something works. In order to prove something works, you have to meet the policy or regulation and mobilize the research. So there are, I mean, this is part of the problem. So there are people that have done it. There are people that have mobilized huge amounts of will, huge amounts of money, and have been able to go to the politicians and other people and have policy changes made. It's not easy.
No, not everything is AIDS.
No, and not everything is, and there are actually even better examples than AIDS, where there is a disproportionate focus on a particular orphan disease because of the political sort of lobbying that has been done, where there's more money and more research now being funneled or more work that doesn't really, I mean, if you want to look at it from a numbers economy, justify that focus, but it's political. So this is the thinking, this is the way that some of that and your question can actually be thought of or addressed. And part of this, so Bernard Roth, or Bernie Roth, is one of the founders of the D School in Stanford. I actually do a fair number of health innovation type work nowadays. But when he started in around 1969, he started offering a course that he called, and it was revolutionary at the time, Designer in Society. And the whole challenge that he had was, you apply to my course, you decide what you want to do. If you do it, you pass. If you don't do it, you fail. That's it. I will help you along the way. I will try and think this through with you, but it's you that will drive it, you that have to succeed with it. And over the years, some really amazing stuff has come out of that class, and some real garbage. But he also has managed in many ways to motivate people to change the way they work and think about education. Because it forced them to be, you know, we talk about lifelong learning, the person, it's your responsibility, you're not just an apprentice, you're now in charge of your own education. All of those things were tied into what he was doing. And out of that, one of the people that was involved came out and started a company called IDEO. IDEO went on to become one of the biggest sort of companies that does things that most of you have touched, used, or engaged with, whether medical or commercial, retail, whatever. They have done it all. They are essentially a design type think tank that applied his philosophies and some of the things developed at Stanford to problem solving. And they called it design thinking. And about 2 years ago, when I was talking to somebody, design thinking, 2 years ago, it was some of the current high administrators said, I'm allergic to design thinking, I hate this word. And I was at a function in a university recently where the provost and the president, we're all talking about the future of graduate education, where the university is going in the next 2020, 2030 sort of plans. and they said, we're going to use design thinking as the method to solve this because this is all vogued these days. This was a very hard sell 2 years ago even. So what we did was we followed Bernie's advice, which was, if you like an idea, or if you like something, don't copy it, steal it. So we did. So this is based on the design thinking methodology that has years of backing, but is kind of relatively new in the application of this space. And where design thinking starts is empathy. After talking to the researchers and our students in health sciences, empathy was a hard sell. Telling people that you need to start with empathy, believe it or not, met with a lot of resistance. That's wishy-washy. What are you talking about? So we couched it in the word discover. But discover is empathy because it's discover a need. So then we had resistance from people saying, well, patients don't know their need. It's useless talking to patients. We know what they need. No, you're missing the point here. You can't assume you know what people need. You need to discover, find out what a need is. Are you kidding me? What are you talking about? Of course a cancer patient wants to get better. They want a cure. We know their need. Well, as I apologized in the beginning, I'm not an MD, I'm just a PhD. But I happen to sit on the OCREB Research Ethics Board, which has taught me huge amounts. I'm not as perhaps as vocal a participant as many of the other people on it, but I sit and I read and I listen and I try to understand the science, but also the subtleties of the politics and conversation that go on. And you know what I've realized? Some cancer patients do not want to get better, do not want a cure. It's conditional. It depends on their circumstance. It depends on who they are. I'm not saying it goes for everybody. I mean, I think most people would want to be healthy if you knew what health is. But some people actually that have cancer still describe themselves as being healthy. These juxtapositions, I can't pretend to fully understand, but that's partly because I'm not them and living their experience. And unless I am able to go and in some way engage with them and learn about their needs, and they may not know what their needs are. That's where the researcher and the person comes in. But by that engagement, someone as a clinician or a researcher, you may observe or notice something that they don't even know or don't even see. At worst case scenario, you will validate your assumptions and then you can move forward. Or you could learn something new. Best case scenario, you are potentially engaging the very people whom you're trying to help and learning what you can do to structure your approach and research to have, in business, they call it essentially a receptor, right? So you are testing an assumption at the very upfront that can potentially improve your chances of translating something because you can already start working backwards from, if this is what they need and want and are willing to do, what do I need to do to get there? Well, it's going to be something about business. So we're going to have to figure out how do we engage the people that have money. There's going to be something about regulations or policy. Well, we're going to have to figure out, you don't have to solve it all, but just even knowing the steps that you might need to go through, you start having a better plan. So when you apply for your research ethics board, your protocol can include steps that will make it easier later on. And if you start working it backwards, it's not simple. But the argument is that you may have a better chance if you start out by knowing this is something that somebody out there wants. From the business world, it's your research market analysis. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not discovery science. This is not about, I need to be free, intellectual randomness, serendipity. That is super important. Discovery science is the absolute basis. Without knowledge to translate, without the stuff, the material, there is nothing. And shrinking the budgets for discovery and basic science is not a good idea. It's a horrible idea. But in addition to the discovery science, there is room for the kind of scientist or the kind of thinker that says, okay, I've identified this need. I understand this kind of science, and I understand this direction. How do we get there? What do we develop? How do we repackage the knowledge in such a way that it can be made acceptable? So in terms of your example, so your brother, for example, could have, and it may not have solved his problem. I'm not saying that this is one solution fits all, but he could have gone to the producers knowing where they want to position their show and say, wait a minute, this is what I want. And they would have said, no, we don't want that. We want to make money in this market segment with this audience. And then he could have said, well, I'm not interested. Or he could have said, okay, fine, I understand. I need to do this. Like, then there isn't that mismatch of expectations. If you're talking about policy, one of the biggest things is find out who the policymakers are, what their thinking is. How do you couch what you're trying to do? Or how do you get people to help you? How do you get the people that are the champions on board early enough in the project so that you might have a chance? No guarantees. I'm not saying that there's a guarantee and this will lead to positive results every single time. But the argument is that if you know the steps that are involved, if you have a plan, even if you can't execute it yourself, you at least know the resources, the people, the understanding that you may need that may help you change some of the direction in some way to improve your results. So this is not a magic bullet by any means. And it's iterative. You always have to check back and make sure you understand. And making the wrong assumption means without validating that I'm going to do this just because. So one of our students started along this route, and she said, you know, there's potentially some benefit to a ketone-based diet for women that are recovering or undergoing chemotherapy for breast cancer. So that's what they need. That's what I'm going to develop. And so she started working on that project. And we said, wait a minute, how do you know this? Well, because this is what I'm working in the lab. We know this is going through trials right now. This is going to need to be done. So if I start on this project now, this will be done. Well, how do you know this? How do you know this is the need? How do you even talk to a single patient? No, we can assume this is what they want. So I said, well, back up. You're essentially going to tell women who are undergoing chemotherapy for breast cancer that what they need to do is diet? Like, just step back. You know, even if you change the way you position it, you're more likely to understand it. But, you know, just try and identify what the need is or validate it with people. And this was very hard to battle. Essentially, because we got stuck on this need part with her, she actually had to go and talk to people, and she found that she couldn't access any breast cancer people at the time because there's no science that will back this up. It's still in trials. So you can't even begin to sell a diet concept to someone, at least legitimately, as a scientist and ethically to somebody, until you know that there's a chance that it'll help them. And if you can't make that claim, then you can't really say to them, you know, what do you want out of this? So as it turned out, by doing that investigation, she learned that there are other morbidities that, or there are other sort of conditions where this ketone approach has been used since the 40s. And actually, you can access those patient groups, and actually, they're perfectly willing to talk to you. And actually you can find out what they need and what they want, and once you engage, you can get a better understanding. And then when and if there is data to support that this also helps people with breast cancer go through chemotherapy, the transition becomes a relatively simple one because you already understand some of the needs. And so then how you frame your problem becomes contingent on how you understand the need. And this is where and this is also definition in terms of thinking. Where we ran into troubles with the traditional design thinking process was in the next step. It didn't exist. And we realized, that in the next step, in terms of health science, you can't get around this. If you're doing a web, or if you're doing some sort of app somewhere, validating that A, it's ethical, B, that there's regulatory permission, or C, that you can actually do it, is not quite as important, perhaps, arguably, when you're dealing with people's lives and people as a whole. Before you start spending millions of dollars figuring out, you need to A, validate again the need that you've understood it correctly, B, validate whether it's possible. What are the policy barriers? Is there a way around it? It could be absolutely impossible to do. If there is absolutely no shot at it, do you still want to do this? And you may decide you do. So we know one of our mentors, so we rely heavily on mentors. Her father had a heart condition, went to a hospital. They said he was fine. He was out on his own later on, had a heart attack. She was passionate. She wanted, and now there's political things obviously, but there must be a better way to monitor people and longer than the 70s devices that you have going. I have high blood pressure, so I've worn them. I know exactly what she's talking about. So she found that on the market there was already a device that was portable, that sent data back, that was secure. The problem was there was no OHIP code for it. So nobody would use it or replace it. And so this technology, which had 30 years more sort of life, advances to it, wasn't being used because of the regulation. So even though there was nothing, there was a constraint in policy and resources, she decided, wait a minute, I'm going to go for this. And she had a lot of drinks, apparently, talked to a lot of secretaries, went to a lot of parties, did things that you wouldn't believe she had to do in order to convince people to change the OHIP code, to allow for this already existing technology to be brought into the system. But she did that partly because she realized that's what she needed to do and sort of worked it backwards. There was a clear need. She identified it. She knew there was a receptor. There were definite barriers. So now she had to figure out how to solve them.
So I just have a comment. A lot of what you talked about here, I think, could perhaps be helped by reference to the Rockmans that you mentioned earlier. An awful lot of what you described is change management. And there's a whole theory and whole business behind that actually could be, whether you use the Kotter approach or whatever, that, it wouldn't go the whole way across, but it would take a lot of, certainly in the translational space, of how to actually make change that's sustained in the healthcare system. And I would suggest that, perhaps I'm sure you have, but that's an area of which the learnings from the business world could actually be used here or the healthcare.
So I 100% agree with you. And actually, I haven't gotten to it. Maybe I should just skip ahead really quickly. But part of what we teach, couched in some of the things, is project management, change management, group building, leadership, not networking, but relationship management, the soft skills I spoke of before. So Rodman has increasingly adopted the design thinking approach to change management. And as I said, we shamelessly built onto that framework. So yes, you're absolutely right. And this is, as I said, this isn't new. This is also the engineering approach, right? If you deconstruct it, they start with a problem. They know that there's a problem that needs to be solved. Then they work backwards. How do we solve it? It's not always right, but it sometimes leads to better bridges. And this, where it's novel is that, at least from our perspective, what we're seeing is there are a whole range of people that have never thought about things this way. And the way, when you start getting them to teach, to think about this way, it takes some time and some guidance and quite often a lot of support and networking, but then they kind of get this aha moment.
Do you spend any time working with the new medical school, curriculum renewal, or any of the health profession schools? Because your first example that you gave about, there was this chasm, and then after so many years, they went back and started working together. I mean, nipping it in the bud when they're in training is something that we sort of wrestle with here, but it's very difficult because there's a hidden curriculum out there. They get a lot of mixed messaging when they work on other projects. You try to instill, those values in them, and then it gets crushed by sort of what actually goes on, and it's really challenging.
It is really challenging. Ironically, what we've been doing is very easy for us. It seems to be working. This is the aha moment. This is why I'm still excited and absolutely generating beats, despite the politics and others. So yes, we've had a number of conversations with Marcus Law. We know the space there. In fact, one of the ongoing conversations is how do we include this within the medical curriculum and adapt it to it. The reality is we have 17 students. At the current moment, I am the only faculty directly appointed to this program, and the appointment is not a full appointment. And then we have a part-time administrator. Even though these work and we have a lot of support from various levels, the traditional echelon of academia is still a pretty hard nut to crack. And quite frankly, that's the barrier. So yes, I would love to work on that, but I just don't have the capacity. And Norm Rosenblum was very supportive because he was involved. If you look at our board of directors, half of the vice deans and whatever are on there. But there is a difference between some of the leadership and some of the directors, chairs, and that have grown up in an existing system. There's a lot of resistance to this type of approach because we give a lot of freedom to the students to do whatever capstones they want. Our only condition is one person is a graduate appointed faculty member on their committees. The rest can be, God forbid, patients or domain experts or community. For a grad school, this is like, well, what do? You have classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so you don't need any more budget because they're obviously not doing anything else once they leave the class. Why do you need to have an administrator on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday? So there is ingrained system policy changes that we face every day as well. So I'm open to any form of collaboration you want. We have a lot of this stuff that we can implement and work across hospitals. We're actually trying to work with some hospitals to find places for students to go in and do needs analysis. And our students aren't they're not undergrads. Some of them are really high functioning PIs already. So having them have different perspectives would be amazing. But we've only been also around for 10 months. So can't do anything. So that's the program. If you have any questions or comments, I was going to talk a little bit about mission, our teaching philosophies, what we do. We're based on experiential learning. This is another hard sell 2 years ago. Now everyone's talking about it. You do and you reflect on it, and then you think about it, and then you abstract and you move it forward. We talk about collaboration and all of these things, core competencies. These are some of our students, people that have participated in various ways. We've structured it so clinicians come from Sunnybrook and commit to this. Our current cohort is, again, we're planning it, and has everyone from a PhD. We have an engineer this year, which is really exciting. And our new program that we're trying to get off the ground, we haven't had capacity, is to actually work with hospitals, with PIs or departments that have somebody that will be interested in doing a graduate program and a project within their department as sort of translational by design. And the idea would be to essentially, skip this, sorry. is that we would, if this person applies and is part of it, the department would provide $5,000 in seed money to them to start on a project once they're ready and work with them to develop a project, and the IMS, and we actually have a donor that has committed money that if there's a match, that will provide $5,000 to their tuition. We do not provide stipend. We do not expect the people that work with our students to fund them. It's great if they do. But the students have to hustle, find their own non-traditional funding sources. MyTax, various other forms, that's part of the learning. They have to pay tuition. They have to work their butts off. The thing I can report is halfway through the first cohort, those that weren't already employed have found various ways and projects to engage in. So that in itself is really positive. There are many, many things that I would love to keep talking about, but I see that I must stop. If anyone wants to talk more about any of this stuff, I'm always open for coffee. And so reach out and let's start the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.